Hello, welcome to our talk on mentoring across differences. My name is Rita Lee. I use she, her pronouns. So I do not have any financial disclosures for this talk. Our learning objectives for today are to recognize how identity influences inclusion, to reflect on the impact of power and hierarchy in mentor-mentee relationships, and to describe best practices for culturally responsive mentorship. By way of background, we recognize that the bulk of the workforce in STEM does not match the demographics of the United States. We also know that diversity improves problem solving, analytic thinking, decision making, and productivity. So, over the years, we've noticed that there has been an evolving demographics of the workforce, including generational changes and other different demographics. It becomes increasingly likely that we will be working with and mentoring people who are different than us. And in this case, right, potentially very different in terms of even what might be defined as a donut in these cases, right? It's not just a variety of donuts, but it's a variety of different options that are considered donuts in different cultures. We also must recognize that their lived experiences are different than ours, and we must learn how to meet their needs to foster inclusion, belonging, and retention, as well as appropriate mentorship. One of the first things we need to understand is the relationship between identity and a sense of inclusion and belonging. So, what is identity? How do we define it? So, identity is the composite of who a person is. It includes their values, their roles, as well as their social identities. And identity formation includes three key tasks. One, discovering and developing one's potential. Two, choosing one's purpose in life. And three, finding opportunities to exercise that potential and purpose. And when we think about social identities, it requires both a sense of belonging to a particular social group and recognition as an accepted member of the group from existing members of that particular social group. And it also requires competence, which are skills and opportunities to act in their desired role. So, when we think about what shapes our identity, there are so many different factors that shape our identity that can include physical ability, their personality, personal status, parental status, work experience, etc., as well as social identities and other aspects of identity that can be influenced by the dominant culture, whether people might have power or in certain areas of their identity or less power in other aspects of their identity. And when you think about identity interference, that happens often in STEM as well as academic environments, is that individuals are often expected to conform and assimilate into the dominant culture of a particular group. What can happen is that that leads to then compartmentalizing one's identities in order to fit in because they feel that one identity may interfere with successful performance of another identity. And this can often lead to separate social and academic peer networks, minimizing displays of their identity, and compartmentalization rather than integration. Resolving this interference by disidentifying, minimizing, or downplaying their devalued social identity can in turn challenge a student's sense of authenticity and sense of belonging in their particular discipline. And that can result in lower academic or professional performance. Further, students who feel they must change themselves and their identities to fit in are more likely to experience depression, reduced psychological well-being, and impaired academic performance. And there's extensive evidence that confirms that these tensions can arise from being, quote unquote, the other, the only one, or the unknown, simultaneously bringing invisibility to one's identity as a scientist or as a member of a particular group, and too much visibility to one's underrepresented identity. And when we look at the science of effective mentorship, we know that effective mentorship requires that faculty have an awareness of any identity-related challenges their mentees may have, as well as a set of learnable skills to effectively support the talent development of students or mentees in the context of the realities in STEM. And that includes understanding power dynamics, recognizing the cultural tax, as well as being culturally responsive. Right, recognizing that we all work in different hierarchies and hierarchical systems where certain aspects of our identity may offer higher power in certain places and certain settings, right? And thinking about the cultural tax of being potentially identified as quote unquote the only one who represents the entire group, or the pressures of representing an entire group when there are not many um, of a certain identity within a given culture. And then when we think about culturally responsive mentorship, these are the effective mentorship behaviors that go with that. So it's aligning expectations, assessing understanding, communicating effectively, addressing equity and inclusion, fostering independence, and promoting professional development. So let's start with align expectations. So it's critically important that we make our expectations explicit at the beginning of the mentor-mentee relationship. So this means creating a safe space for mentees to make their expectations explicit. You have to have that conversation. We encourage you to use curiosity to foster a holistic understanding of your mentee. Explore any unique challenges that they might be facing and be clear about the goals of the relationship. Which domain of mentorship are you going to explicitly focus on? And then it's critically important to be honest about what you can and can't do. And how are you going to address missteps if they occur? In thinking about those mentoring domains that we talked about in the Mentorship 101, which one of these areas are you going to be focusing on? Because we know that you can't do all of these. We strongly encourage you and the mentee to consider picking maybe just one primary area and potentially a secondary area to focus on. When we think about including being culturally aware, it's also recognizing your own culturally shaped beliefs, perceptions, and judgments. We want to be cognizant of any cultural differences and similarities between yourself and your mentee, right? How do you each define success? What was your path to getting to where you are, and how does that impact your advice? Even simple things like what does timely mean to you? Is timely 24 hours? Is it 2 hours? Is it 3 days? And what does effective communication look like? And do you have a shared understanding around language? Even thinking about something like bi-weekly, right? Bi-weekly can mean twice per week, but it can also mean every other week. And you want to make sure that you're actually communicating effectively and understanding that meaning between the both of you. We also want to be aware of what the research shows about trainee experiences, particularly those who might be underrepresented or under-resourced. So there's sometimes challenges with this concept of professionalism, conflating differences or different styles, different hairstyles, different dress, etc., with being unprofessional. There has also been evidence of stereotype threat, where we transfer what is known out there into experiences, right? And we hold people to different stereotypes that may not actually reflect their true identity or behavior. There also can be challenges in shared stories where they hear stories directly or indirectly from other individuals about their experiences with professionalism, including cautionary tales of what not to do. There may also be double standards where there's different levels of scrutiny or punishment, depending on one's identity or different interpretations of the same professional action based on a particular identity factor. And then institutional policies that sometimes impact mentees' abilities to advocate, or dress policies, et cetera, that tend to reinforce the dominant culture. Next, we want to focus on assessing understanding. So when we want to assess understanding, we really want to understand what the mentees know and are capable of and consider what they can do to further develop and achieve success, right? We want to know what they know, quote unquote, about the system as well as the policies, recognizing that so many of our policies may be written, but many of them become unwritten policies of, quote unquote, the way you navigate through an academic environment that many people don't have exposure to unless they have, family members or know other people who have been in the system before. And when you consider the capability of your mentee, you want to recognize the benefits and challenges of the meritocracy. We want to really emphasize potential rather than past accomplishments. And we want to recognize individual capacity compared to structural barriers. And as you may know, when we look at education in the United States, we found that on every tangible measure, schools serving greater numbers of students of color typically have fewer resources than schools serving mostly white students. This means that minoritized students often have fewer and lower quality books, curricular materials, laboratories, computers. Some elementary schools don't even have STEM programs, and they typically have less qualified and experienced teachers. In the educational system, we recognize that minoritized students are also not treated or evaluated fairly, and this can have legacy impacts that reverberate, right? In this study done by Yale Child Study Center, they looked at how teachers detect challenging behavior in the classroom. And in this study, teachers were asked to watch video segments of preschoolers engaging in various activities. And they were told that some clips may or may not contain challenging behaviors and were asked to press the enter key on the keypad every time they saw a behavior that could become a potential challenge. Each video included 4 children, a black boy and girl and a white boy and a girl. And here's the deception. There was no challenging behavior. The Yale team also asked subjects to identify the child they felt required the most attention. 42% identified the black boy, 34% identified the white boy, while 13% and 10% identified the white and black girls, respectively. Recognizing that, right, there is a bias in terms of who is being watched and what we are anticipating based on stereotypes in the dominant culture. We also know that the standardized tests have a history of bias in them. After SAT questions are written, they are sent through a panel for analysis, including checking for bias. Data analysis of test questions which have been released found that 99% of the chosen favored white students over Black and Hispanic students. 99% of the math questions chosen favored male students over female students. And SAT scores correlate strongly with geographic residence, which includes factors such as socioeconomic status, school district, and availability of resources. This extends to higher education as well as the workplace. In one study, students who identified as white consistently received higher final clerkship grades and more honors, whereas URM students received lower grades across clerkships. Latina, Black, and Asian students were 2 to 6 times less likely to be selected for honor society memberships, such as Alpha Omega Alpha, after adjusting for test scores, research publications, as well as leadership activity. A separate study found that in performance reviews, women had more vague praise and more specific on ways to improve performance and or achieve, fewer ways on specific ways to improve performance or achieve promotion compared to men. In other studies, students were asked to evaluate the leader in a case where the leader was identified as either Heidi or Howard. The only thing that was changed about the case was the name and pronouns. Students were much harsher on Heidi than on Howard across the board. Although they think she's just as competent and effective as Howard, they don't like her, they wouldn't hire her, and they wouldn't want to work with her. We also need to consider that there might be biases that impact letters of recommendation, right? There are data that describe gender bias in reference letters. In this study, they found that letters for women were shorter, contained more doubt raisers, such as, quote unquote, given the right environment, I think they could succeed. They used grindstone adjectives, which describe how hard someone had to work, implying that they may be less intelligent, skilled, or qualified. For example, quote unquote, they worked so hard or put in tremendous effort. They also included more references to teaching than research. In another study focusing on race, they found that Black and Latina applicants were described with fewer agentic words than white and Asian applicants. Standout words such as brilliant or superb were used infrequently for underrepresented individuals, and they were more likely to have those grindstone adjectives that were described above. The next thing we need to think about is communicating effectively, right? That includes active listening, with open-ended questions, inquiring about the need for adaptive aids or accommodations, again, timely as well as constructive feedback that will support their growth and development, and recognizing that communication styles and meanings might differ. And we do need to be aware of code switching. So, code switching involves adjusting one's style of speech, appearance, behavior, and expression in ways that will optimize the comfort of others in exchange for fair treatment, quality service, and employment opportunities. So, we need to recognize that some of our mentees are having to do this extra work on a regular basis in order to quote unquote fit in to the dominant culture, and creating safe spaces for them to be their authentic selves in our conversations. The next step is to address equity and inclusion. And this can be, in yourself as reflecting and accounting for any biases or assumptions that you might bring to a mentoring relationship, and account for how your background might differ from that of your mentee. And this does not mean avoiding these conversations about their lived experiences. So when we look at the data, we found that when mentors held a colorblind perspective and preferred to suppress discussions about race and other dimensions of diversity or identity, mentees described receiving career support but not psychosocial support. When mentees felt uncomfortable, they said it was a barrier to forming a closer relationship and reported they could not trust their mentor to make decisions based on race in a racially diverse workspace. So we encourage you to leverage curiosity, having some increased awareness of maybe some of the unique challenges that they might be facing, be aware of stereotyping, try to have a holistic understanding of the mentee, and engage in reciprocal relationship building. We encourage you to consider what is their context, like their overall life context, their situations, what might be their styles in terms of work, communication, etc. Understand their lived experiences and recognize and create those areas of safe spaces for honest and open dialogue about what they might be experiencing. The next step in effective mentorship behavior is to foster independence. This means building their confidence, stimulating their creativity, acknowledging their contributions, again, doing your best to reduce that identity interference, and helping them chart a path towards independence. There's an article in the Harvard Business Review that says that imposter syndrome is really generated from a series of experiences of kind of different cognitive biases, as well as microaggressions that lead to people doubting their own abilities. And lastly, we want to promote professional development, and that is helping them set their career goals that align with what their specific goals are and not what potentially we have learned or the dominant culture says one's career goals ought to be. We want to foster and help them develop a professional network and access resources that will be helpful in their professional development. Lastly, I know you won't do this, but this is a slide about what not to do as a mentor. So don't take credit for your mentee's ideas or usurp their lead position on a project. Don't insist that they advance your projects rather than allowing them to develop their own network. Don't handcuff the mentee to your timeline, slowing their own progress if you're slow to get back to them. Don't discourage them from seeking other mentors. As we talked about, we have multiple domains of mentorship that can be filled by ideally a team of mentors. Okay. And we also don't want to allow our mentees to repeat common self-destructive mistakes, or what we call mentee missteps, without reining in such behavior. All right. Thank you very much. I look forward to the debrief.